There's a person in someone's life who always seems to know when something is wrong before a word gets spoken, who texts at the exact moment something difficult is happening, who listens in a way that makes a person feel, sometimes for the first time in a long time, genuinely heard, who remembers the small things, the things that most people forget the moment a conversation ends, who gives and gives and gives, not because they are performing kindness, but because they cannot help it. Because feeling what the people around them feel is not something they choose to do. It is simply what their nervous system does, automatically and constantly, with a depth that most people cannot fully imagine, because most people have never experienced it from the inside. And then one day that person is gone. Not dramatically, not with a fight or a confrontation or an explanation that gives anyone anything to hold on to. They are simply less available, then unavailable, then absent in a way that feels complete and final, like a door that has been closed from the inside and will not be opened again regardless of how long or how hard someone stands on the other side of it. And the person who lost them spends months, sometimes years, trying to understand what happened, trying to identify the moment things changed, trying to figure out what was done or not done that turned the warmest and most generous presence in their life into someone who no longer returns calls. The answer, when it finally arrives, is almost always the same. Not one large betrayal, not one dramatic moment of cruelty. A pattern, a slow accumulation of specific behaviors that individually might have seemed small or even invisible, but that an empath's nervous system registered with precision every single time they occurred. Because that is what empaths do. They feel everything. They notice everything. And when what they are feeling and noticing tells them repeatedly and unmistakably that the relationship is costing them something they cannot afford to keep paying, they do the only thing their survival instincts finally allow them to do. They disappear. This video is going to name those behaviors, 7 of them, clearly and directly, grounded in the research of Daniel Goleman, whose work on emotional intelligence reshaped how the scientific community understands empathy and why some people feel things at a depth that others simply cannot access. This is not about blame. It is about understanding what an empath is actually experiencing when these behaviors appear, why those experiences accumulate into a breaking point, and what it looks like when someone who has spent their entire life absorbing the weight of a relationship finally decides to put it down. Right now, before going any further, if this kind of video has ever said the thing that needed to be said, take 2 seconds. Like this video, because every like helps this message reach the person who needs it most today. Subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell, because conversations like this one happen here consistently, and the next one might land at exactly the right moment in someone's life. And in the comments right now, drop the city or country watching from, and the time it is right now in that part of the world. It does not matter if it is a quiet Sunday morning, a sleepless 3 in the morning, or a lunch break stolen from a day that needed a moment of something real. People are watching this from Cape Town and Toronto, from Manchester and Manila, from small towns that nobody has heard of and big cities where it is still somehow easy to feel completely alone. Drop the location and the time, because this community is real, and right now it is worth knowing who is in the room. Number 1, dismissing what they feel as too much. An empath who is told that they are too sensitive, too emotional, too intense, or too much in response to expressing something genuine does not experience that as a casual remark. They experience it as a verdict, a ruling on the validity of their inner world delivered by someone they trusted enough to let inside it. And the cruelest part of it is not the words themselves. It is the timing. Because the empath was not performing when they expressed what they felt. They were trusting. They were extending the most honest and vulnerable version of themselves into the space between 2 people. And what came back was a message that the extension was excessive, that the honesty was too much, that the trust had been misplaced. Daniel Goleman, in his foundational work on emotional intelligence, documented what he called empathic accuracy, the capacity to read another person's emotional experience with genuine precision. Empaths operate with a level of empathic accuracy that sits far outside the normal range. They are not imagining what they feel. They are not overreacting to nothing. Research on mirror neuron activity and emotional contagion confirms that highly empathic individuals genuinely absorb the emotional states of others at a neurological level. They feel them in their bodies, not just in their mind. When someone tells an empath that what they are experiencing is too much, they are not helping the empath regulate. They are invalidating a biological reality. They are telling a person with genuinely heightened neurological sensitivity that their heightened neurological sensitivity is a character flaw. And the empath, who already knows that they feel things more deeply than most people around them, who has probably spent years wondering whether that depth is a gift or a liability, hears that message with devastating precision. Most people do this without malicious intent. They say things like, "Calm down," or "You are making this bigger than it is," or "Why do you always have to make everything so emotional?" or "Can we not do this right now?" They say these things because the empath's emotional depth is genuinely unfamiliar and sometimes uncomfortable to witness, because seeing someone feel that deeply can activate a discomfort in people who have learned to keep their own feelings at a manageable distance. The dismissal is often a defense mechanism, not a deliberate cruelty. But what the empath hears is not a defense mechanism. What they hear is that who they are is inconvenient, that the way they move through the world is a problem to be managed rather than a quality to be respected and held with care. And they file that. They do not always show that they have filed it. They will often nod and pull back and make themselves smaller in that moment, because empaths have an extraordinary capacity to absorb discomfort without broadcasting it. They've spent entire lifetimes practicing the art of holding their own pain quietly so that the people around them do not have to feel responsible for it. But the filing is happening, and they are counting, even without meaning to count. Every time the depth of what they feel is treated as excessive, the count goes up. Every time they are asked to flatten themselves to fit the emotional range the other person finds acceptable, the count goes up. And at some point, that count reaches a number that the relationship cannot come back from. Goleman identified emotional validation as one of the foundational building blocks of what he called social intelligence, the ability to navigate human connection in ways that build genuine trust rather than eroding it. Validation does not mean agreeing with everything someone feels. It means acknowledging that what they feel is real, that it makes sense given their experience, that their inner world deserves to be taken seriously rather than efficiently resolved. Telling a person repeatedly that what they feel is excessive is the opposite of validation. It is a sustained message that they must diminish themselves to be acceptable in the relationship. Empaths can absorb that message for a surprisingly long time, because their care for the relationship is enormous and their tolerance for personal discomfort is high. But they cannot absorb it indefinitely. The moment their nervous system concludes that the relationship requires them to be less than they actually are in order to stay in it, the countdown to disappearance has already begun. They may not know it yet. The other person almost certainly does not. But the internal process is already in motion, quiet and irreversible. Drop the words, "My feelings are valid," in the comments if someone in your life has ever made you feel like feeling deeply was something to be ashamed of. Number 2. Using their empathy against them. This is the behavior that empaths find hardest to name while it is happening, and hardest to recover from once they finally see it clearly. It works like this. An empath, by nature, will reach toward distress. When someone near them is in pain, the reflex to help, to listen, to absorb the burden, and do whatever is necessary to ease it, is not a choice they make in the moment. It is wired into how they function. Daniel Goleman described this as empathic concern, not just understanding what another person is feeling, but being genuinely motivated at a cellular level to do something about it. And there are people who learn, sometimes consciously and sometimes entirely without awareness, to use that concern as a lever, not always consciously. Sometimes the pattern develops organically, without either person fully understanding what is being established. One person in the relationship discovers, through repeated experience, that expressing distress causes the empath to immediately shift their attention, energy, and resources toward them. So distress becomes the currency of the relationship. Whenever something is wanted, attention, effort, accommodation, a change in the empath's behavior, an abandonment of the empath's own plans or needs. Distress is expressed, and the empath, because they cannot not respond to genuine seeming pain, delivers what is needed. The distress works every time. And so it is used again, not from a place of calculated cruelty, but from a place of learned behavior. The pattern teaches itself because it keeps being rewarded. What makes this particularly devastating is that the empath's own integrity makes them resistant to naming it. They know that some of the distress is real. They know the person is genuinely struggling with things that deserve compassion. To name the pattern feels, from the inside, like accusing someone of faking their pain. And an empath would rather absorb the cost than make an accusation they cannot be certain of. So they keep giving, keep responding, keep orienting their relational energy toward easing a distress that replenishes itself whenever the supply of ease runs low. Imagine someone in a close friendship who notices that every time they mention having a plan for themselves, an evening alone, a trip, a goal that requires their own time and energy, the other person develops some kind of crisis. Not dramatically, not obviously, but reliably. A difficult conversation arrives. A vulnerability is expressed that the empath feels compelled to stay and address. The empath keeps adjusting their own life to accommodate the recurring distress, but somewhere in the body below conscious thought, a pattern is being registered. And the body of an empath is extraordinarily good at registering patterns. The empath's entire nervous system is, at its core, a pattern recognition instrument tuned to the emotional frequency of other people. Research on compassion fatigue, a phenomenon documented extensively in clinical psychology, and originally studied in nurses, therapists, and emergency workers who spent their professional lives in sustained contact with others suffering, shows that one-directional empathic output without adequate reciprocity or recovery leads to a predictable and painful progression. First exhaustion, then emotional numbness, then a kind of withdrawal that protects what remains of the self. The empath does not become a different person. They become a depleted version of themselves who has finally run out of what was being taken. And when that happens, when the well genuinely runs dry, they do not stay to explain what happened. They find somewhere quiet and begin the slow, private work of becoming whole again, without the relationship that emptied them, without looking back, because looking back would mean feeling it all again, and they are already too tired for that. Number 3, being consistently inauthentic. This one is less obvious than the others, but among the most reliable predictors of an empath's eventual exit from a relationship. Empaths are not just emotionally sensitive, they are extraordinarily attuned to the gap between what a person says and what that person actually means. Goleman documented this in his research on social awareness, the component of emotional intelligence that involves reading the unspoken emotional reality of a situation rather than just its surface content. Empaths do this automatically, continuously, without choosing to, at a level of precision that is genuinely uncomfortable for people who are accustomed to managing others through the careful curation of appearances. When someone is being inauthentic around an empath, performing a version of themselves rather than simply being themselves, the empath feels it before they can articulate it. They cannot always immediately identify what is off, but something is. The words say one thing, and the energy says something else entirely. The smile is present, and the warmth behind the smile is not. The assurances are offered, and the body, the tone, the quality of attention is somewhere else. The enthusiasm sounds correct and lands hollow. Empaths have what researchers describe as heightened sensitivity to emotional incongruence, the mismatch between what is being displayed and what is actually being experienced. And their nervous system, which has been calibrated since childhood to pick up on precisely these kinds of signals, registers the incongruence with the same reliable accuracy that it registers everything else. What makes inauthenticity so specifically damaging in a relationship with an empath is not just that they detect it. It is that detecting it and saying nothing creates its own particular interior pain. They are holding the awareness of the gap while simultaneously choosing, out of love or loyalty or the reluctance to create conflict, to pretend the gap does not exist. They are doing two things at once, feeling the truth and performing the fiction of not having felt it. And that internal doubling is exhausting in a way that is difficult to explain to someone who has never experienced it. It is the specific fatigue of knowing something that the relationship requires them to not know. Imagine spending an evening with someone who insists they are fine, who performs fine with conviction, who responds to the empath's careful inquiries with reassurances that are, technically, probably true, and the empath sits with the gap between the reassurance and what is actually filling the air, absorbing both, translating both, while saying nothing that would make the other person feel caught or exposed. Because empaths are gentle like that. Because they would rather carry the discomfort of the unspoken truth than put another person through the discomfort of having it named. But the carrying has a cost, and the cost, accumulated across months and years of being with someone who consistently performs rather than actually arrives, becomes something the empath cannot keep paying. Goleman described genuine connection as requiring what he called emotional honesty, the willingness to bring one's actual inner experience into the space between two people, rather than a carefully managed version of it, tailored to produce a desired response. Empaths are built for genuine connection, not the performance of connection, not the version that looks like warmth but is actually distance wearing a pleasant face, but real contact between two real people who are both actually there. When that contact is consistently replaced with performance, the empath does not argue or accuse. They go quiet in the way that people go quiet when they have stopped expecting something they once hoped for. And then, eventually, they go entirely. Drop the words, "I see what words hide," in the comments, because an empath always does. Always. Number 4, making them responsible for your emotional regulation. There is a difference between leaning on someone in a difficult moment and requiring someone to manage the emotional weather of daily life. The first is intimacy. The second is something that wears a costume of intimacy but functions over time as something more like a transfer of burden. And empaths, because of how they are wired, are extraordinarily vulnerable to the second one being mistaken for the first, by the other person, and sometimes by the empath themselves. Because the empath genuinely wants to help. The desire to ease another person's distress is not performed. It is real, and it is powerful. And so, when a relationship gradually shifts to a place where the empath is expected to be the emotional regulator, the person who senses every mood shift and responds to it, who anticipates irritability and adjusts their own behavior to prevent it, who absorbs and processes and neutralizes emotional instability so that the other person can function more comfortably. The empath often does not initially resist. They do what they do. They absorb. They adjust. They manage. Daniel Goleman's research on emotional intelligence made a critical distinction that illuminates exactly what is happening in this dynamic. Empathy, he documented, involves feeling with another person, reaching across the space between two people, and making genuine contact with their experience. What researchers and clinicians describe as enmeshment involves something categorically different, losing one's own emotional boundaries in service of another person's experience. The first is a gift that enriches a relationship. The second is a slow dissolution of the self that eventually has nothing left to give. Research in clinical psychology on enmeshment shows that empaths are particularly susceptible to this pattern precisely because their capacity for emotional absorption is so extraordinarily high. They walk into a room and feel the mood before anyone has spoken a word. They carry other people's anxiety in their own chest as if it were their own. They cannot simply turn that off. It is not a choice they are making. It is what their nervous system does. And in a relationship where someone is consistently generating emotional weather that the empath is expected to manage, the empath is not just being helpful. They are disappearing into the other person's emotional world, one absorbed feeling at a time, until the territory of their own inner experience becomes smaller and harder to locate. They reach for their own feelings and find someone else's there instead. They try to identify what they need and discover that they have not thought about what they need in so long that the question feels foreign. Imagine someone who realizes, during a rare moment of stillness, that they cannot remember the last time they made a decision about their own day without first calculating how it would affect the other person's mood. They cannot remember the last time they came home from something and felt their own feelings about it before first checking on how the other person was doing. They cannot remember when it stopped being a choice and became just the architecture of the relationship. That realization, quiet, slow, devastating in its ordinariness, is often the moment an empath begins to understand what the relationship has actually been costing. Not in a dramatic flash of clarity, in a quiet, persistent recognition that they have been somewhere else for a very long time, and that where they have been is inside someone else's experience, at the expense of their own. When an empath hears that alarm clearly enough, when the recognition arrives fully formed that the relationship is not large enough to contain two people because it has been built entirely around one, they trust it. Empaths have been trained by a lifetime of feeling everything to trust what the body says is true. And the body, at that point, is saying something very specific, something quiet and clear and non-negotiable. And they listen. Number 5. Neglecting to reciprocate. Empaths give in a way that most people do not encounter very often in a single lifetime. They give attention that is genuine and focused and warm, the kind of attention that makes a person feel that they are the only person in the room, that whatever they are saying matters deeply and is being received fully. They give care that is specific and precise, not the generic reassurance that gets offered when someone does not know what else to do, but the exact acknowledgement of the exact thing that is actually hurting, delivered with the particular tenderness that comes from someone who felt the pain before you finished describing it. They give presence in the full sense of that word, because for an empath, being present with another person is not a performance of attentiveness. It is the complete orientation of their awareness toward another human being. It is what their whole system does when they love someone. And this quality of giving, which is genuinely rare, which most people have never been on the receiving end of at full strength, tends to create something in the people who receive it. Not always gratitude, though often that. Sometimes a kind of unconscious assumption, an expectation that has become so quietly embedded in the structure of the relationship that the person carrying it has not even noticed it is there. An assumption that the empath's attention and care and presence will continue to arrive regardless of what is offered in return. That it is simply what the empath does, the way a river simply flows without requiring anything from the landscape it moves through. Goleman documented that emotionally intelligent relationships are characterized by what he called attunement, the mutual, ongoing process of each person reading and responding to the other's emotional experience. Attunement is not about transactions. It is not about keeping a ledger or demanding perfect symmetry in every exchange. It is about both people in the relationship making genuine, consistent attempts to see and feel and respond to each other, to notice when the other person is carrying something heavy, to ask about it, to sit with the answer even when it requires more than a quick fix, to be curious about the interior life of the other person with something approaching the same curiosity that the empath brings to everyone they love. When an empath is in a relationship where this is consistently one-directional, where their attunement to the other person is thorough and sustained and the other person's awareness of the empath's inner experience is minimal or largely absent, they do not immediately complain about it. Complaining is not their first language. Their first language is continued giving, in the quiet hope that the relationship will eventually find its own equilibrium, that the other person will eventually look up from their own experience and notice that the empath has been standing there, fully present, for a very long time, that the noticing will eventually produce something that feels like genuine reciprocity. But when the equilibrium never comes, when the giving continues and the receiving is so consistently absent that the empath begins to feel invisible, not unkindly treated, not deliberately overlooked, but genuinely unseen, like a person who has been generous in a room where no one has looked in their direction in months, something profound and painful shifts. Because empaths can survive many things. They can survive difficulty and conflict and loss and the ordinary grinding hardship of living in a world that does not always feel safe for people who feel everything. What they struggle to survive in a relationship is invisibility. The specific and hollow pain of giving everything they have to offer and finding that the person they are giving it to is simply not curious about them in return. Not curious about what they feel, what they need, what is happening in the interior of their experience on any given day. Goleman wrote that empathy is not only about feeling another person's experience. It is about demonstrating that the feeling has registered, about making the other person feel felt, truly felt, in a way that changes how they carry themselves through the rest of the day. An empath who has spent months or years making everyone around them feel felt, and who has never been made to feel felt by the person they have invested most in, eventually stops waiting for it to change. Quietly, without drama, with the specific kind of heartbreak that does not announce itself because announcing it would require asking for the very thing that has not been given, and an empath who has already asked in every way they know how, through patience, through continued presence, through the sustained offering of everything they have, does not ask again. They simply stop showing up in the way they once did, and then, gradually, they stop showing up at all. Drop the words, "I deserve to be seen," in the comments. Say it clearly, because an empath deserves to be seen just as deeply as they see everyone else. Number 6, punishing them for having boundaries. This is the lesson that is the revelation of this video. It is the one that reframes everything before it, because there is a common misunderstanding about empaths that persists even among the people who genuinely care about them. The assumption that empaths do not really need much in the way of limits or protected space. That a person who feels things so deeply, who is so oriented toward the needs and experiences of others, must by nature be infinitely available. That their generosity implies an inexhaustible supply. This misunderstanding is not only factually wrong, it is one of the most quietly damaging things that can enter an empath's life, because it makes the very act of self-protection feel like a betrayal of who they are. The truth, documented thoroughly in research on highly sensitive individuals and grounded in Goleman's framework for emotional intelligence, is precisely the opposite of this assumption. Because empaths absorb so much, because they are processing not just their own emotional experience, but a continuous, unfiltered stream of input from everyone around them, from the room they walk into, from the conversation they overhear, from the unspoken tension in a relationship that has not been addressed in months. They require more time and space for recovery and restoration, not less. Dr. Judith Orloff, a clinical psychiatrist at UCLA who has spent decades working with empaths and highly sensitive individuals, documented that without adequate alone time and genuine protected space, empaths move through 3 predictable stages. First, overwhelm. Then emotional withdrawal that looks from the outside like distance or coldness, but is actually the nervous system protecting itself from inputs it no longer has the capacity to process. Then a kind of shutdown that can persist for a very long time, and that the people around the empath rarely understand because they have never been told what was actually happening beneath the surface. The boundary is not a rejection of the relationship. It is the mechanism by which the empath sustains the capacity to be in the relationship at all. This is perhaps the most important sentence in this entire video, because when an empath sets a boundary, when they say they need some time alone, or they cannot take on something additional right now, or a particular kind of interaction is too much for them in this moment, they are not pulling away from the relationship. They are doing the maintenance work that allows them to come back to the relationship fully present, rather than exhausted and depleted. The boundary is an act of care for the relationship, extended from a person who understands their own limits clearly enough to protect both themselves and the connection they value. When someone responds to that boundary with hurt, with the subtle shift of mood that communicates disappointment or resentment, with the withdrawal of warmth that functions as punishment for the empath having asked for something they need, with the guilt-laced silence that says your self-care is an inconvenience to me, the empath receives that response with their entire nervous system. They feel the punishment acutely. They feel the withdrawal. They feel the implicit message that their need to protect themselves is a problem to be solved rather than a reality to be respected. And because they are empaths, because they absorb what is in the space between people with extraordinary precision, they feel the message even when it is never said directly. Imagine having the courage to say, for perhaps the first time, that they need an evening alone, that they are feeling overstimulated and need to restore themselves. And the response, not in words but in the quality of everything that follows, communicates that the request was received as a rejection. The messages become slightly cooler. The interaction when they reconnect carries a residue of something that was not there before. Nothing is said explicitly, but everything is communicated. And the empath, who hoped that the boundary would be met with understanding, who took a risk in expressing a genuine need, has learned something about the safety of expressing genuine needs in this relationship. They have learned that expressing what they need produces a cost, and the cost is paid in the currency of the relationship's warmth. That lesson is filed with the same precision with which everything else is filed, and eventually the file becomes heavy enough that they stop risking it. Number 7, staying the same while asking them to keep giving. This is the final behavior, and in many ways it is the one that does the deepest and most lasting damage. Not because it is the most dramatic, but because it is the most sustained. It is the long, slow, invisible pattern of a relationship that is settled into a version of itself that serves one person comfortably while costing the other person continuously. Where the empath has been absorbing and adjusting and giving without complaint for so long that their absorption and adjustment have simply become the baseline, the thing that is expected rather than received with any awareness of what it actually takes. The thing that was once noticed and appreciated and sometimes even marveled at has become, through the quiet process of sustained exposure, simply the background of the relationship, the water the relationship swims in, invisible, assumed, unremarkable. And the empath who has reached this stage of a relationship is operating in a particularly painful kind of silence. They are not being treated badly, strictly speaking. There is no overt cruelty. There is no obvious neglect. There is simply the accumulated weight of years of giving that was received without being truly registered, of growth that happened only on one side, of a relationship that has stopped moving forward because one person stopped reaching and the other person has been too invested to say so. Daniel Goleman made a distinction in his research between what he called empathic resonance and empathic concern. Resonance is the experience of genuinely feeling with another person, of making real emotional contact with their experience rather than simply observing it from a distance. Concern is the active, motivated response to what has been felt, the willingness to change one's behavior, to reach, to grow, to become someone who honors what they have been given. Relationships built on sustained, one-directional empathic concern, where one person is perpetually tuned into the other's experience and consistently motivated to respond to it with genuine care, while the other person remains largely unchanged in their attunement and their willingness to grow, produce a very specific kind of long-term damage in the empathic person. Research on compassion fatigue confirms this in the context of personal relationships. The empath does not stop caring. They lose the capacity to translate caring into action, because the resource that caring requires has been spent past its sustainable limit. Imagine looking back across the length of a relationship and trying to identify what changed, what grew, what shifted in the other person over those years. Trying to locate the evidence of movement, of effort, of the kind of reaching that says, I am trying to understand what your experience actually is, rather than simply relying on your capacity to understand mine, and finding very little. Not because the other person is cruel, not because they are indifferent in any obvious way, but because they have not had to grow. Because the empath has been quietly doing the relational labor that growth requires, absorbing the friction, filling the gaps, smoothing the surfaces, so effectively and so consistently that the other person has not felt the pressure that usually motivates people to change. What makes this so difficult for the empath to name is that the person on the other side of it is often genuinely well-meaning, often genuinely fond of the empath, often completely unaware of what has been happening or of what it has cost. They believe the relationship is fine because from where they are standing, it is. Because the empath's extraordinary capacity for absorption has been functioning all this time as a kind of invisible support structure that has kept the relationship functional and the other person comfortable without requiring them to contribute to either. And when the empath finally, exhaustedly, quietly begins to withdraw that support, not with an announcement, not with a confrontation, but simply by having less to give and being less willing to offer what remains, the other person often genuinely does not understand what changed, because from where they were standing, they never saw what the empath had been holding. They were standing on it. The departure of an empath from a relationship that has reached this point is often the quietest and most complete departure the other person has ever experienced, because it does not arrive as a dramatic exit. It arrives as a slow, gradual absence of warmth and presence, and the particular quality of attention that made the relationship feel different from every other relationship the other person had ever been in. And only in the absence of it does the other person begin to understand, sometimes fully for the first time, what they had been receiving, and what it would have taken to keep it. Every one of these 7 behaviors carries the same message, even when it arrives in different forms. That the empath's inner world is less important than their usefulness to the relationship. That what they feel is excessive unless it is being directed towards someone else's needs. That their boundaries are problems, their depletion is invisible, their depth is inconvenient, and their departure will be a surprise to the person who caused it. Goleman wrote, across decades of research, that genuine emotional intelligence requires 2 things above all others: the willingness to feel accurately what another person is experiencing, and the courage to let that feeling change the way one behaves toward them. An empath brings both of these things to every relationship they enter. What drives them away in the end is the sustained experience of being in a relationship where neither is being returned. Here is what a person who has read this far now knows that they did not know 30 minutes ago. The empath in their life is not gone because they stopped caring. The empath is not gone because something broke suddenly or unforgivably. The empath is gone because they felt everything, held it for as long as they could, and eventually made the choice that their survival required. And the gap they left behind, the sudden absence of that particular quality of attention and warmth and genuine, unhurried care, is not something that gets replaced easily, because empaths are rare. And the people who truly understand what they are and what they need and what it costs them to show up the way they do are rarer still. If there is an empath in someone's life right now, the question worth sitting with is not whether they are still there. The question is whether they feel safe enough, seen enough, and whole enough in the relationship to stay, because they are already doing the mathematics. They have been doing it quietly, precisely, and with the full weight of everything they feel for longer than anyone knows. And what they have arrived at is a number. And that number, for most empaths, has a limit that no one else will be told about until it has already been reached. Someone who understands these 7 behaviors does not walk away from this video as the same person who started it. Someone who genuinely receives this information carries it differently through every relationship they move through from this moment forward. Someone who has sat with this long enough to feel it, not just understand it, has become the kind of person who makes an empath feel safe enough to stay. Most people who lose an empath spend a long time afterward trying to understand what happened. They revisit the moments. They look for the one thing that explains the departure. They never quite find the full picture because the full picture was never made visible to them. The empath was keeping something, quietly and without complaint. Counting, not with any intention of reaching a verdict, but because their nervous system was registering everything and filing it with the precision it always brings to what it has experienced. And at some point the file reached a weight the relationship could not justify, and they made the only choice their survival allowed, without drama, without a final accounting, without explaining, because explaining would have required asking for an understanding they had already spent years hoping would arrive on its own. The person who watches this and genuinely lets it land carries something different into every relationship from this point forward. They notice the empath beside them more precisely. They ask the question that has not been asked. They meet the boundary with care instead of the quiet withdrawal that punishes. They stay curious about the interior of another person's experience, rather than relying on that person's willingness to always be curious first. They make the empath feel felt, in the way the empath has been making everyone around them feel felt, quietly waiting for someone to do the same. That is who they are now. Not perfect, not without the old patterns, but aware. And awareness, as Daniel Goleman spent his career demonstrating, is where everything that matters begins. Like this video, if something in it named something that has been living wordlessly in the chest for a long time. Share it with someone who has an empath in their life and does not yet fully understand what that actually means. They need this more than they know, and the empath in their life needs them to understand it. And subscribe to this channel, because the next video goes into what empaths do with the pain after they have already left, and why understanding that process is what makes it possible to ever truly reach them again.